Welcome to Theology Talks. Have you ever wondered how the powerful medieval church dealt with those who dared to challenge its authority? Today, we delve into the 6 great heresies of the Middle Ages, movements that dared to defy the status quo and laid the groundwork for change. From the Paulicians to the Hussites, discover the stories of these so-called heretics and their impact on religious history. Let's explore the complex dance between power, faith, and dissent in a time where questioning the church could cost you everything. The medieval church secured its control over the spiritual life of Europeans during the early Middle Ages, around 476-1000, and strengthened that power through the high 1000 to 1300 and late Middle Ages, 1300 to 1500. Over time, the clergy grew increasingly corrupt, neglecting core Christian values while living extravagantly on the people's tithes. Parish priests became so associated with hypocrisy and sin that anti-clericalism spread across Europe even before the High Middle Ages, leading to the rise of alternative belief systems, which the church labeled as heresies. There was little the common people, or even the nobility, could do about this corruption, as the church controlled access to salvation. According to the church, eternal life could only be achieved by following its precepts, and the alternative was an eternity in hell or a temporary, but equally grim, stay in purgatory, where one's sins were burned away. Heaven, hell, and purgatory were seen as inevitable after death, and since the church made all the rules about where a soul would end up, people had no choice but to tolerate the clergy's behavior. Christian Mass was conducted in Latin, the Bible was written in Latin, and prayers like the Our Father and Hail Mary were memorized in Latin, a language unfamiliar to the peasantry and even most nobility. This placed Christ's teachings, as recorded in the Bible, firmly in the hands of the clergy, who claimed only the church could interpret God's intentions. The Catholic Church was the dominant form of Christianity for most Europeans, except for those aligned with the Eastern Orthodox Church, until the Protestant Reformation, 1517 to 1648, diminished its power. However, before the Reformation, various heresies provided alternative ways for people to express their faith outside the rigid confines of church doctrine. The heretics, although Europe was officially Christian during the Middle Ages, several movements questioned the church's teachings and tried to form their own versions of Christianity. Movements like the Paulicians, Bogomils, and Cathars blended ideas from Persian Manichaeism, Greek Gnosticism, and Christianity to create sister religions, which the church condemned as heresies and sought to eliminate. Among the many heretical movements, these 6 had the most significant impact and inspired others: Paulicians, Bogomils, Cathars, Waldensians, Lollards. The church suppressed all 6, often resulting in the mass slaughter of populations that had no connection to the heresy. The church, which fueled fear of hell and purgatory, saw heretics as a threat, akin to a contagious disease that had to be isolated from the public while attempts were made to cure them. The initial attempts to counter heresy relied on words, missionaries debating with heretics to bring them back to orthodoxy. But heretics often out-argued the Catholic clergy, prompting more severe measures, which culminated in events like the Albigensian Crusade, 1209 to 1229, and the rise of medieval inquisitions. Early heretics and Nicaea. From the 1st to the 4th centuries, various groups interpreted Christianity in different ways. After Constantine the Great legalized Christianity, he called for a unified faith, leading to the First Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. Before this, teachings like those of Arius, who rejected the Trinity, were considered valid forms of Christianity. The 4th century Ebionites, for instance, denied Christ's divinity, adhering to adoptionism, which held that Jesus was a sinless man adopted by God but not his begotten Son. Meanwhile, the Donatists in North Africa believed clergy had to be sinless to administer rites. Constantine, who believed he saw Christ in a vision before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312, had no patience for doctrines that denied Christ's divinity or questioned the purity of clergy. These teachings were condemned at Nicaea, which established Orthodox Christianity. Among the many changes Nicaea brought was the demotion of women in the church. Before the council, records show women playing significant roles in the early church. After Nicaea, however, women were barred from authority positions, reflecting the Orthodox vision that suppressed any alternative forms of Christianity. The Church and temporal power. The Church gained temporal power through secular means, supported by emperors like Constantine and his successors. Since the Church was tax-exempt and required tithes, it accumulated wealth, which it translated into land and power. In the 8th century, a forgery known as the Donation of Constantine claimed that Constantine had ceded his power to the Pope, allowing emperors to rule only by the Pope's grace. Although the impact of this document is debated, its concept, that the Pope had temporal power, encouraged further church involvement in state affairs. Pepin the Short, king of the Franks, gifted the church land, establishing the Papal States. The church could raise militias, engage in military campaigns, and pressure monarchs into submission. This growing involvement in secular matters sparked conflict, most notably in the investiture controversy, where factions like the Guelphs supported papal supremacy and the Ghibellines backed the Holy Roman Emperor. Heretical movements, however, directly condemned the church's hypocrisy and corruption. 6 great medieval heresies. The sacraments, including baptism, marriage, and communion, were central to being in God's grace, but these rites had to be performed by Catholic clergy. The Church charged fees for these rituals, and many noticed that the clergy lived in luxury while demanding much from the faithful. Criticism of this behavior was dangerous, as it would have required reform, which the Church resisted. Still, voices like Peter Abelard's 1079 to 1142, who called for rational investigation into church teachings, were raised. Abelard was condemned, his work burned, and he was forced to recant. Other so-called heretics took their message to the people, who often welcomed new ideas before the Church crushed them. The 6 most significant heresies arose as reactions to the Church's corruption, each with a unique vision of spirituality and the divine. Paulicians, 7th to 9th centuries, formed in Armenia, rejecting the divinity of Christ and the veneration of Mary, along with all the sacraments and the Church's hierarchy, were also rejected. They opposed the idea that communion with God required an ordained Catholic priest. Constantine Sylvanus was stoned to death by church order, and many of his followers were later burned at the stake for heresy or relocated in hopes they would reform. These survivors influenced the rise of the Bogomils. The Bogomils, 11th century, were a religious sect from the Balkans, whose name means those dear to God in Slavic. They were dualists, believing the world belonged to an evil deity, and life's goal was to resist worldly temptations and free the soul to return to God. They denied Christ's divinity, rejected the sacraments and church hierarchy, and incorporated elements of Manichaean beliefs and Greek Gnosticism. The Church persecuted them through numerous crusades, but their influence persisted and shaped Catharism, the most famous medieval heresy. Cathars, 11th to 13th centuries, also called Albigensians for their association with Albi, were a sect in southern France with beliefs similar to the Bogomils but more developed. They were dualists and Gnostics who venerated the feminine divine principle Sophia, wisdom, claiming the Church had corrupted her message. Their clergy, known as perfecti, practiced abstinence, vegetarianism, and poverty, in contrast to the Catholic clergy. Some scholars suggest their views influenced the French poetic genre of courtly love, particularly connected to Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter, Marie de Champagne. The Church suppressed the Cathars through the Albigensian Crusade. The Waldensians, 12th century, were distinct from these earlier groups. Founded by Peter Waldo, circa 1177, a wealthy merchant from Lyons, France, Waldo gave up his fortune, embraced poverty, and preached a doctrine based on Christ's teachings. He translated the Bible into his native Provençal language and preached directly from it. Waldo and his followers criticized the Church's materialism and rejected the sacraments, except for baptism and communion, as well as purgatory and the veneration of saints and Mary. When Waldo sought approval from Pope Alexander III in 1179, he wasn't branded a heretic but was discouraged from preaching. Later, the Waldensians were declared heretics and fled to the Italian mountains to escape persecution. Lollards, 14th century, were followers of John Wycliffe, an English priest, philosopher and Oxford professor who pushed for major church reforms. The name Lollard likely came from a derogatory term for people who mumbled prayers, rooted in a Dutch word. Wycliffe translated the Bible from Latin to Middle English, making it accessible to the public. He was protected by Oxford under academic freedom, but after the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, where a Lollard leader emerged, the church and state began to persecute the group. In 1395, the Lollards issued the 12 Conclusions of the Lollards, a document condemning church practices like its involvement in state affairs, celibacy, payment for prayers, the Crusades, transubstantiation, relic veneration, and pilgrimages. Despite persecution in the 15th century, they survived underground and gained respect during the English Reformation. Hussites, 15th century and beyond, followed Jan Hus, a philosopher and theologian, rector of Charles University in Prague, who was inspired by Wycliffe's work. Hus echoed Wycliffe's call for reform, which had been banned in Bohemia. He was not considered heretical until he opposed the sale of indulgences, writs that reduced time in purgatory, a practice Wycliffe also denounced. Hus was put on trial and burned at the stake in 1415. His death sparked the Hussite Wars, 1419 to 1434, between his followers and Catholic forces. Like the Lollards, the Hussites endured the Crusades against them and were later vindicated by the Protestant Reformation. Conclusion: it's easy to wonder why major reform wasn't initiated earlier, but as mentioned, the Church held a complete monopoly over the spiritual lives of medieval Europeans. People at the time had few alternatives for spiritual expression, and the fear of hell made spiritual salvation essential. While the Church originally provided important services, it eventually exploited its power to suppress dissent. It took the courage of brave individuals and the changing spirit of the times to finally break the Church's hold, leading to the Protestant Reformation.